The lights flickered across the dark water, impossible and mesmerizing. Laurie Wicken's knuckles blanched white against the steering wheel as he slammed on the brakes, his old Chevy skidding to a halt on the coastal highway. 4 startled voices erupted simultaneously in the car. "What the hell is that? Jesus Christ, is that a plane going down? It can't be. Look how it's moving." The night air carried the scent of salt and fish as the 5 friends scrambled out of the vehicle, their eyes locked on the bizarre luminous object descending toward Shag Harbour. Stars punctured the October sky above Nova Scotia's rugged coastline, but they paled against the rectangular formation of lights hovering over the Gulf of Maine. "It's about 300 meters offshore," Peter whispered, his breath forming clouds in the autumn chill, and way too big to be a small aircraft. Laurie fumbled for the flashlight in his glove compartment, his hands shaking as adrenaline coursed through his veins. The sleepy fishing village of Shag Harbour had never seen anything like this. No one had. The whistling sound cut through the night, rising to a pitch that made them cover their ears. "It's like a bomb," Norman gasped, pointing as the object began to lose altitude. "Listen." The whistling transformed into a whoosh that seemed to displace the very air around them. Then came the bang loud enough to echo across the harbor, to wake residents from their beds, to send dogs barking in distant farmhouses. 11 witnesses now, as curious residents emerged from nearby homes, all watching in stunned silence as the object, still illuminated by pulsing lights, began to float on the water's surface. Reflections danced across the black waves, creating an eerie halo around the craft. "Somebody needs to call the Mounties," Laurie said, his voice sounding foreign to his own ears. People could be dying out there. Mary, a retired school teacher who had stepped out onto her porch at the commotion, shook her head slowly. "That's no airplane, boy. I've lived here 70 years and never seen anything like it." Her weathered face looked ghostly in the distant glow from the water. The object began to sink. "It's going under," shouted Ralph, a fisherman who had sprinted from the local tavern at the sound of the impact. "Sweet Mother of God, it's submersing." The strange lights continued to shine for several long moments as the craft descended beneath the surface, illuminating the water from below with an otherworldly amber glow before finally fading into the depths. Laurie was already running to the payphone outside Williams General Store, fumbling with coins as he dialed the Royal Canadian Mounted Police Detachment in Barrington Passage. His friends stood transfixed at the shoreline, watching the spot where the object had disappeared. "RCMP, Constable Richards speaking." "You need to come quick," Laurie panted into the receiver. "An airplane or something just crashed into the harbor at Shag. We need help out here. People could be drowning." Within 15 minutes, 2 RCMP cruisers roared into the village, red and blue lights slicing through the darkness. By then, local fishermen were already preparing to launch their boats, grabbing life preservers and flashlights, their faces grim with the responsibility of the rescue mission ahead. "Where exactly did you see it go down?" Constable Zach Nickerson asked, scanning the dark waters with his department, issued flashlight. "There." Laurie pointed to a spot where a strange yellow foam now floated on the surface. It hovered for almost a minute before it sank. The first boats pushed off from shore, powerful spotlights crisscrossing the crash site as fishermen called out into the darkness. No debris, no oil slick, no signs of wreckage one would expect from a conventional aircraft crash. "Rescue Coordination Center, Halifax. This is RCMP Barrington Passage." Constable Richards spoke urgently into his radio. "We have multiple credible reports of an aircraft down in the waters off Shag Harbour, requesting immediate air-sea rescue support." From her front porch, Mary clutched her housecoat tighter against the chill. "They won't find survivors," she murmured to no one in particular. "Whatever that was, it wasn't one of ours." By midnight, the Canadian Coast Guard cutter had arrived from Clark's Harbour, its powerful searchlights joining the local fishing boats in sweeping the Gulf. Hushed conversations spread among the gathering crowd as more villagers arrived to witness the commotion. "Did you see how it moved before it crashed? Those lights weren't like any aircraft I've ever seen. My dog was going crazy 10 minutes before we heard anything." At the crash site, Captain Paul Matthews of the Coast Guard peered into the dark waters, perplexed by the complete absence of wreckage. 23 years at sea, and he'd never encountered anything like this. His radio crackled to life. "Captain, This is RCC Halifax. Be advised, all commercial, private, and military aircraft are accounted for along the eastern seaboard. Repeat, all aircraft accounted for. Continue search for unidentified object. In the tense silence that followed, Captain Matthews exchanged glances with his crew. The implications hung heavy in the salt air. By dawn, whispers of UFO spread through the gathered crowd. In Ottawa, a priority telex from RCC Halifax reached the Air Force Headquarters Air Desk that handled all civilian and military UFO sightings. Priority, UFO report. Object crashed Shag Harbour NS. Conventional explanations dismissed. Underwater search recommended. Laurie Wickens sat on the rocky shore as the rising sun painted the harbor in pale gold, his eyes bloodshot from a sleepless night. Whatever he and his friends had witnessed sink into these waters was about to draw naval divers, military officials, and reporters from across Canada to their tiny fishing village. Within hours, their account would dominate the front page of the Halifax Chronicle-Herald, and within days, government officials would be scrambling to explain what 11 ordinary citizens had seen crash into the waters off Shag Harbour on October 4, 1967. None of them knew that this night would become one of the most documented UFO incidents in Canadian history, or that 50 years later, people would still be seeking answers about what really happened in the waters of the Gulf of Maine. The object, and whatever secrets it contained, now lay somewhere beneath the waves, waiting to be found. What if the truth has been waiting all along just beneath the surface, ignored because it didn't fit the world we thought we understood? The October wind cut sharp across the small fishing village of Shag Harbour, Nova Scotia, carrying the mingled scents of salt and diesel as the afternoon light began to fade. Just another Wednesday in 1967, a year when the world seemed to teeter on the edge of both wonder and chaos. Laurie Wickens, barely 19, wiped engine grease from his hands as he finished tuning up his Chevy. The car wasn't much to look at, but it was freedom in a place where the horizon was mostly water and opportunity often meant leaving. Tonight was just about cruising Highway 3 with friends Norman, Peter, and the others would be piling in soon enough. Old Ralph watched from his porch across the way, pipe smoke curling around his weathered face. The retired fisherman rarely missed anything happening on their street. Laurie offered a casual wave before slamming the hood shut. The radio inside crackled with news about Vietnam, protests in America, and the space race-distant concerns in a village where most families had been fishing these waters for generations. Here, time moved to the rhythm of tides and seasons, not headlines. Further up the coast in Halifax, Air Canada Flight 305 was preparing for its evening departure to Toronto. Captain Pierre Charbonneau reviewed his flight plan while First Officer Robert Ralph performed the final checks. Just another routine flight across Canadian airspace zone they'd made dozens of times before. The weather was clear all the way to Toronto. It should have been smooth sailing. Yet Charbonneau felt something about the evening's subtle charge in the air he couldn't quite place. 23 years of flying, including combat missions, had given him a sixth sense about the skies. But he dismissed the feeling as the jet engines roared to life. Meanwhile, aboard the fishing vessel MV Nickerson cruising 17 miles offshore, Captain Leo Howard Mersey frowned at the Decca radar display. 4 stationary blips arranged in a rough rectangle shouldn't be there not unless another fishing fleet had anchored, which made no sense in these waters. His first mate suggested it might be a glitch in the new Decca units, but something in Mersey's gut, the same instinct that had guided him through 32 years at sea, told him otherwise. In Mahone Bay, 12-year-old Daryl Dorey sat on the front porch with his sister KK and their mother, enjoying the rare warmth of an October evening. His science homework lay forgotten beside him as he gazed at the darkening southwestern horizon. He daydreamed about joining the Air Force when he was older, his mind filled with images of jets and rockets. The space race had captivated his imagination, along with every other kid in his class. None of them noticed the faint shimmer on the horizon, like heat rising from asphalt and gone so quickly it could have been a trick of the fading light. How often do we miss the extraordinary simply because we're too certain of what the world is supposed to be? Back in Shag Harbour, Mary Thompson, the village's retired schoolteacher, marked her 70th birthday by writing letters to former students now scattered across Canada. 70 years in the same village, watching generations come and go like the tides. Through her window, the last fishing boats were returning to harbor for the night, their lights bobbing like earthbound stars. At the RCMP detachment in Barrington Passage, Constables Zach Nickerson and Jim Richards were ending a quiet shift. The most excitement they'd had all week was breaking up a minor scuffle at the tavern on Saturday night. The daily report showed nothing of interest, and the radio remained silent beside them. Another dead night, which suited them fine. In the newsroom of the Halifax Chronicle-Herald, reporter Ray McLeod was wrapping up an article about rising fishing quotas when the first call came in. A woman's trembling voice described something strange in the sky over Halifax harbor lights, moving in ways that planes just don't move. He might have dismissed it entirely if the phone hadn't immediately rung again. And then again. By the third call, he was standing at the window, peering out into the darkening sky over Halifax. At 7:15 p.m., high above the towns of Sherbrooke and Saint Jean, Quebec, First Officer Ralph noticed something strange off the left side of the aircraft. Captain Charbonneau's gaze followed, his practiced eyes instantly registering what his mind struggled to comprehend: a brilliantly lit rectangular object tracking parallel to their aircraft, a string of smaller lights trailing behind it. 4 minutes later, as they watched in stunned silence, a silent explosion blossomed near the object. 2 minutes after that, a second explosion faded into a blue cloud surrounding the bizarre craft. Charbonneau's hand hovered over the radio. What exactly was he supposed to report? How would it sound? He'd been flying since the war, had a perfect record, a reputation to maintain. On the MV Nickerson, nearly 20 fishermen now stood on deck, pointing at 4 bright objects hovering in a rectangular formation high in the northeastern sky. The first mate, who dismissed the radar readings earlier, whispered in disbelief. Captain Mersey was already on the radio to Halifax, requesting information on any scheduled military exercises in the area. In Mahone Bay, young Darrell Dorey watched wide-eyed as a large object maneuvered impossibly above the horizon. His mother's coffee cup slipped from her fingers, shattering on the porch boards. The Chronicle, Herald's switchboard, was lighting up with calls from across Halifax, dozens of citizens reporting strange lights moving over the harbor around 10 o'clock p.m. Ray McLeod had abandoned his fishing quotas article entirely, frantically taking notes as he peered through the office windows. Whatever was happening up there, it was going to be tomorrow's front page. All across Nova Scotia's Atlantic coast, from Halifax to Mahone Bay to fishing vessels at sea, ordinary people were witnessing something extraordinary, something that defied explanation. Yet in Shag Harbour, life continued its peaceful rhythm, oblivious to the unusual events unfolding elsewhere along the coast. Laurie Wickens and his friends piled into his Chevy for their evening drive, radio blasting the latest hits. Mary Thompson sealed her last letter and prepared for bed. The RCMP officers in Barrington Passage filed their reports on a quiet day. None of them could have known that in just a few hours, at approximately 11:20 p.m. Atlantic Daylight Time, their small fishing village would become the focal point of one of the most well-documented UFO incidents in Canadian history, an event that would draw military divers, government officials, and international attention to their quiet corner of Nova Scotia. The calm waters of Shag Harbour reflected the stars above, peaceful and undisturbed. For now. Before we continue the video, make sure to hit subscribe. The first unusual reports barely registered against the white noise of rural Nova Scotia life. A boy in Mahone Bay writing to the RCAF Greenwood base commander about strange objects in the sky. A captain filing paperwork about radar anomalies. Scattered calls to Halifax newspapers about lights moving in impossible patterns. Isolated incidents, easily dismissed, until the pattern began to emerge. Through the early evening of October 4th, 1967, the strange phenomenon multiplied across the Atlantic coast. Witnesses separated by miles observed the same rectangular formation of lights. The pilots of Air Canada Flight 305 documented silent explosions in the sky. 20 fishermen aboard the MV Nickerson watched 4 bright objects hovering in formation over the northeastern horizon, their captain's radar confirming what their eyes struggled to accept. The disparate sightings formed a geographic trail moving southwest from Quebec along the coast, appearing over Halifax Harbour at 10 o'clock p.m., before continuing toward the isolated fishing villages at Nova Scotia's southern tip. Each report added a layer to the mystery: rectangular formations, silent explosions, blue clouds, hovering capabilities beyond any known aircraft. By 11 o'clock p.m., Laurie Wickens and his 4 friends were cruising Highway 3 near Shag Harbour, unaware they were driving directly into the path of whatever had been traversing the Canadian coastline for the past 4 hours. The radio played "Light My Fire" by the Doors as they rounded the curve that offered a sweeping view of the harbor. Norman was the first to notice something in the sky that didn't belong. The rectangular object descended at an angle that suggested controlled flight rather than freefall. Its lights pulsed in an organized pattern, illuminating the October sky with an amber glow. The 5 young men pulled over, their music forgotten as they watched the craft approach the water's surface. The whistling sound cut through the night air like a bomb. Peter would later tell investigators, followed by the whoosh and finally the bang that echoed across the harbor. But there was no explosion, no shower of debris. Instead, the object appeared to float on the water's surface, its lights still visibly pulsing about 300 meters offshore. Whatever this was, it wasn't a conventional aircraft crash. Laurie ran to the nearest phone booth, his fingers trembling as he dialed the RCMP detachment in Barrington Passage. The dispatcher initially assumed it was a prank. 5 teenagers reporting a UFO wouldn't normally warrant an emergency response. But the earnestness in Laurie's voice and his insistence that people might be drowning convinced them to send officers to investigate. As he waited for authorities, Laurie returned to the shore where more witnesses had gathered. Mary Thompson, the retired schoolteacher, stood wrapped in her housecoat. Ralph Jenkins from the tavern. The Bradley family from the house on the hill. 11 witnesses now watched the impossible object floating on the dark water, its lights reflecting off the gentle swells. When RCMP Constable Zach Nickerson and Jim Richards arrived 15 minutes later, they too saw the strange lights offshore. Their training offered no protocol for this scenario. Radio communication with the Rescue Coordination Center in Halifax confirmed the proper procedure, treated as an aircraft crash until proven otherwise. But before any rescue boats could launch, the most disturbing development unfolded before the assembled witnesses. The object, still illuminated, began to sink beneath the water's surface. Not like a damaged aircraft taking on water, but in a controlled, deliberate descent as if it had decided to submerge. The gathered crowd fell silent as the lights disappeared beneath the waves, leaving behind only a strange yellowish foam that several witnesses would later describe. Within 30 minutes, local fishermen had launched their boats, heading toward the crash site with flashlights and life preservers, driven by the maritime code that demanded assistance to vessels in distress. The RCMP officers coordinated from shore, their radio crackling with updates from the Rescue Coordination Center as a Coast Guard cutter was dispatched from Clark's Harbor. The search continued through the night, spotlights crisscrossing the dark waters. But the rescuers found nothing but just the vast emptiness of the Gulf of Maine, betraying no evidence of what 11 credible witnesses had observed. By morning, the fracture lines in conventional explanation began to show. The Rescue Coordination Center in Halifax confirmed what would transform this from a search and rescue operation into something far more perplexing. All aircraft, commercial, private, and military, were accounted for along the entire eastern seaboard. Whatever had crashed into Shag Harbour was not a known aircraft. The Canadian military apparatus shifted into a new mode of operation. RCC Halifax sent a priority telex to the air desk at Air Force Headquarters in Ottawa Division responsible for handling UFO reports. The message was clear: conventional explanations had been exhausted. This was officially classified as a UFO report. If truth surfaced before our very eyes but came dressed in the unfamiliar, would we recognize it or dismiss it simply because it didn't come with instructions? Squadron Leader Bain at the air desk reviewed the accumulating evidence. Multiple witness accounts from different locations along the coast throughout the evening. Radar confirmation from the MV Nickerson. The Air Canada pilot's report, and now a craft submerging into the waters off Shag Harbour. He sent a priority telex to Navy headquarters recommending an underwater search. For the residents of Shag Harbour, the morning brought the first signs that their small village had become the epicenter of something extraordinary. Military vehicles appeared on the coastal road. Men in uniforms conducted interviews with witnesses. Telephone lines buzzed with calls from reporters. Laurie Wickens found himself recounting his experience repeatedly to RCMP officers, military personnel, and finally to Ray McLeod from the Halifax Chronicle-Herald. Each retelling forced him to confront the strangeness of what he had witnessed, to put words to something that defied conventional description. By October 7th, the story had reached the front page of the Chronicle-Herald. could be something concrete in Shag Harbour UFO, RCAF. The newspaper quoted Squadron Leader Bain directly. "We get hundreds of reports every week. But the Shag Harbour incident is one of the few where we may get something concrete on it." The public acknowledgement from military officials lent credibility to the witnesses' accounts, but also transformed their experience from a personal anomaly into a public spectacle. Laurie and his friends found themselves at the center of growing attention, their story dissected and scrutinized by strangers. Meanwhile, beneath the surface of the Gulf of Maine, the Canadian Navy mounted its response. 2 days after the incident, a detachment from Fleet Diving Unit Atlantic arrived in Shag Harbour. For 3 days, the divers methodically searched the seafloor where the object had been observed to sink. Their presence amplified the sense that something truly significant had occurred. These weren't local authorities humoring confused witnesses. This was a formal military operation. As the underwater search continued, tension grew among the residents of Shag Harbour. Some embraced the excitement, eagerly sharing their theories with anyone who would listen. Others withdrew, uncomfortable with the attention and implications. Friendships strained as witnesses defended their accounts against skepticism. The familiar rhythm of village life fractured under the weight of the extraordinary. Each day without answers deepened the mystery. What had traversed the Canadian coastline that night? What now lay on the seafloor off Shag Harbour? The absence of conventional explanation created a vacuum that speculation rushed to fill. For Laurie Wickens and the other witnesses, the incident marked a fundamental shift in their understanding of reality. They had seen something that shouldn't exist within their framework of the world, something the authorities clearly took seriously enough to deploy military resources, yet something that remained stubbornly unexplained. On October 9th, the Chronicle Herald published its follow-up story, UFO Search Called Off. After 3 days of searching, the Navy divers had found no trace of the object. "Not a trace, not a clue, not a bit of anything," the Navy stated. The official search had ended without resolution, leaving only questions in its wake. But for the witnesses, the absence of physical evidence did nothing to erase what they had experienced. The whistling sound, the controlled descent, the lights pulsing beneath the waves, these memories remained vivid, undiminished by official reports or the passage of time. As military personnel packed up their equipment and departed Shag Harbour, the village was left changed. Something had entered their waters on the night of October 4th, something that had drawn the attention of the highest levels of Canadian military authority, something that had been officially designated as a UFO in government documents, something that would transform their small fishing village into a footnote in the study of unexplained phenomena. And as the last Navy truck pulled away from the shore, Laurie Wickens stood at the exact spot where he had first witnessed the descent of the unidentified craft. He stared out at the now peaceful waters of the harbor, knowing with absolute certainty that on that night at exactly 11:20 p.m. Atlantic Daylight Time, something from elsewhere had entered their world, hovered briefly on the boundary between sky and sea, and then deliberately chosen to disappear beneath the waves. The world he had known before that moment no longer existed. And make sure you're subscribed because you don't want to miss this. October 4th, 1967, 11:17 p.m. Atlantic Daylight Time. The Chevy's headlights cut through the darkness as Laurie Wickens guided the car along Highway 3. Norman Smith sat beside him while Peter Gorham, Ralph Loomer, and David Kendrick squeezed into the back, their conversation about girls from the neighboring village filling the car as the radio played softly. The road curved to reveal the vast blackness of the Gulf of Maine, broken only by distant lights of fishing boats. Laurie slowed to take in the Viewa habit among locals, even those who'd seen it 1,000 times before. Norman noticed it first. His words died mid-sentence as he leaned forward, squinting through the windshield. Far above the water, a formation of lights moved against the backdrop of stars. Not the steady navigation lights of an aircraft, not the erratic blinking of satellites. Something else entirely. "You guys seeing that?" 4 other pairs of eyes followed his gaze to the strange configuration of lights. Rectangular, amber in color, moving with deliberate purpose. Laurie pulled onto the shoulder, killing the engine but leaving the headlights on. The 5 young men stepped out into the cold Atlantic night, their attention fixed on the object as it began to descend toward the harbor waters. The descent wasn't like anything they'd seen before. Not the graceful approach of an aircraft, not the freefall of a meteor. The object moved as if controlled, intentional, angled toward the water while maintaining its horizontal orientation. The first sound reached them as the object dropped below the height of the surrounding hillside, high-pitched whistling that cut through the quiet night. "Jesus, it sounds like a bomb," Ralph whispered, his eyes wide with recognition. The whistling intensified as the object continued its controlled descent. Then came a rushing sound, a displacement of air that seemed to push against their eardrums even from this distance. "It's going to hit the water," Laurie realized aloud. As if to confirm his words, the object made contact with the surface of the Gulf of Maine. The resulting bang echoed across the water, bouncing off the hills surrounding the harbor, loud enough to set dogs barking in distant farmhouses. Yet there was no explosion, no fireball, no shower of debris. Instead, the object floated on the surface, approximately 300 meters offshore. Its lights continued to pulse, casting eerie reflections across the black water. "We need to report this," Laurie finally said, snapping out of his stunned paralysis. "People could be dying out there." He sprinted back to his car, turning it around with a spray of gravel, and headed for the nearest telephone. His friends remained at the site, watching as other locals began to emerge from nearby homes, drawn by the strange bang. By the time Laurie reached the payphone outside the general store, his hands were shaking so badly he dropped his first coin. Taking a deep breath, he steadied himself and dialed the RCMP detachment in Barrington Passage. "There's been a plane crash," Laurie blurted, his voice cracking with urgency. "In the water off Shag Harbour. We saw it go down. It's floating out there right now." When he returned to the harbor viewpoint, the scene had transformed. At least 6 more locals had gathered, all pointing toward the water where the object continued to float, its lights still visible in the darkness. Mary Thompson, the retired school teacher, stood wrapped in a thick wool sweater. "That's no airplane I've ever seen," she was saying. "Planes don't sit on water like that after a crash." Ralph Jenkins from the tavern had brought binoculars. "Can't make out a shape, just the lights. But they're arranged in a rectangle, like nothing I've ever seen before." The group fell silent as a new development unfolded before their eyes. The object, still illuminated, began to move beneath the surface of the water, not sinking chaotically like a damaged aircraft taking on water, but submerging with what appeared to be controlled, deliberate motion. "It's going under," Ralph whispered, lowering his binoculars. "On purpose." The lights continued to glow beneath the waves for several long seconds, illuminating the water from below with an amber glow that seemed to pulse with an internal rhythm. Then, gradually, the lights dimmed and disappeared, leaving only the dark expanse of the Gulf of Maine. 2 RCMP cruisers pulled up, their headlights sweeping across the assembled group. Constables Zach Nickerson and Jim Richards stepped out, their expressions shifting from professional calm to visible concern as they took in the number of witnesses. As Laurie recounted the events, the other witnesses nodded in confirmation. Multiple independent accounts, all describing the same phenomena: the controlled descent, the whistling sound, followed by a whoosh and a bang, the object floating on the surface before deliberately submerging. Constable Richards returned to his vehicle and radioed the Rescue Coordination Center in Halifax. "We have multiple credible witnesses reporting what appears to be an aircraft down in the Gulf of Maine off Shag Harbour. Witnesses describe an object that was floating but has now submerged. Request immediate search and rescue response." Local fishermen were already pushing their boats into the water, driven by the maritime obligation to assist vessels in distress. Within minutes, 4 fishing vessels were heading toward the site, powerful spotlights cutting through the darkness. When the Coast Guard cutter arrived from Clark's Harbor, its searchlights joined the search, methodically scanning the water's surface for any sign of wreckage or survivors. Captain Paul Matthews directed his crew with practiced efficiency despite the unusual circumstances. By 2:00 a.m., the search had yielded nothing to confirm that anything had entered the water at all, save for the testimony of 11 witnesses who remained adamant about what they had seen. Dawn brought the radio message that would transform the nature of the operation. All aircraft, commercial, private, and military, were accounted for along the eastern seaboard. If no aircraft were missing, what had 11 people witnessed crashing into the harbor? At what point do we stop asking whether something could be real and start asking why we're so afraid to believe it? RCC Halifax sent a priority telex to the air desk at Air Force Headquarters in Ottawa. Priority. Object reported crashed Shag Harbour. Stop. All aircraft accounted for. Stop. Conventional explanations. Exhausted. Stop. Classified. UFO report. Stop. Request. Further instructions. The military response escalated. Official vehicles arrived. Uniformed officers conducted formal interviews. By the second day, a detachment of the Fleet Diving Unit Atlantic was searching the seafloor where the object had last been seen. For 3 days, the divers combed the seafloor, their findings reported directly up the chain of command rather than shared with local authorities or witnesses. The operation was conducted with an intensity that belied the official explanation of routine protocol for unidentified crashes. On October 9th, the Navy abruptly ended its underwater search. The Chronicle, Herald's follow-up story, quoted the official statement, "Not a trace, not a clue, not a bit of anything." The military vehicles departed. The divers packed up their equipment. The village was left with only questions. What had entered their harbor on the night of October 4th? Why had it generated such an intensive military response? And perhaps most disturbing, why had the object appeared to deliberately submerge rather than crash? As Laurie Wickens stood at the shore that evening, looking out at the now peaceful harbor waters, he knew with bone-deep certainty that something profound had occurred, something that had been officially classified as a UFO in government documents, something that had drawn military divers to search their harbor floor. The world as he had understood it no longer existed. The boundary between sky and sea had been crossed by something unknown, something that moved with intention, something that had brought the machinery of military response to their doorstep before vanishing without a trace. The morning after, Shag Harbour awoke to unfamiliar sounds. Vehicle engines that didn't belong to fishing boats, radios crackling with official chatter, the muffled conversations of strangers in government uniforms. Laurie Wickens sat on his front porch, untouched coffee, growing cold between his palms. His eyes were rimmed red from a night without sleep, fixed on the stretch of water where the object had disappeared. Coast Guard vessels still patrolled the area, their methodical movements at odds with the extraordinary nature of what they sought. His mother stepped onto the porch, concern etched in the lines around her eyes. She placed a gentle hand on his shoulder but said nothing. What words could possibly address what he had witnessed? The whistling sound, the controlled descent, the deliberate submergence. These were not the hallmarks of mechanical failure but of intelligent purpose. Across the village, similar scenes played out. Norman Smith lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying the sequence of events in his mind, searching for some conventional explanation that would restore order to his universe. Peter Gorham sat with his father at their kitchen table, both men unusually quiet as they listened to the morning news report that made no mention of the incident. Mary Thompson, the retired school teacher, methodically wrote down everything she remembered in a leather-bound journal. 70 years in Shag Harbour had not prepared her for this moment, but her educator's instinct to document remained intact. October 5th, 1967, she wrote, "The world has changed, though few will acknowledge it." At the RCMP detachment in Barrington Passage, Constables Nickerson and Richards reviewed their incident report one final time before it was transmitted to headquarters. The clinical language of the form unidentified flying object, controlled submergence, no evidence of conventional aircraft, seemed wholly inadequate to capture what they had witnessed. The arrival of a military vehicle in their parking lot confirmed that higher authorities were taking the matter seriously. By midday, the Chronicle, Herald's Ray McLeod had conducted interviews with 8 of the 11 witnesses. In his notepad, he'd written, "Consistency of accounts, remarkably no contradictions, despite independent interviews." The headline was already forming in his mind, though he knew his editor might balk at its implications. He'd been a reporter long enough to recognize the weight of credible testimony, and what he'd heard in Shag Harbour carried that weight. These weren't attention seekers or conspiracy theorists. They were ordinary people struggling to process an extraordinary experience. Down at the harbor, local fishermen gathered in small groups, their day's work abandoned as they watched military personnel establish a perimeter around the search area. The normal rhythms of village life had been disrupted, replaced by a sense of suspended animation. Their theories ranged from experimental aircraft to Russian submarines, but none fully satisfied, each collapsing under the weight of the witnessed behavior. Aircraft crash, submarine surface. This object had done the opposite, with deliberate control that suggested agency rather than accident. How often do we dismiss the extraordinary simply because it doesn't fit the world we think we know? By evening, the military presence had expanded. Additional vessels arrived. Men in diving gear prepared equipment on the deck of a naval support ship. The telephone at Williams General Store rang continuously as news services from Halifax, then Montreal, then Toronto sought local contacts. For the witnesses, the emotional impact was beginning to crystallize. What they had experienced wasn't simply an unusual event, but a fundamental challenge to their understanding of reality. The boundary between what they had believed possible and impossible had been irrevocably breached. Laurie Wickens finally left his porch as the sun began to set, walking down to the shore where a small group had gathered. Norman and Peter were there, along with Mary Thompson and several others who had witnessed the event. They exchanged few words what was there to say that wouldn't sound inadequate. Instead, they stood in silent solidarity, united by an experience that had set them apart from those who hadn't seen. Mary's quiet certainty that nothing would be found, and Norman's skepticism about governmental transparency remained unspoken but understood among them. The question lingered in the air, underscoring their new reality. They had become witnesses to something the authorities clearly took seriously enough to mount a military response. Yet none of them expected full disclosure. As darkness fell again over Shag Harbour, lights from the search vessels created a strange echo of the previous night's illumination. The divers would begin their work in earnest the next day, combing the seafloor for evidence of something that 11 ordinary people knew had entered the water but that officially didn't exist. For now, the village existed in limbo caught between the certainty of what they had witnessed and the uncertainty of its meaning. The world had not ended, but it had irrevocably changed. Whatever lay beneath the dark waters of the Gulf of Maine, its mere presence had torn a hole in the fabric of ordinary life. And as stars appeared overhead, more than one resident of Shag Harbour looked up with new eyes, wondering what else might exist beyond their understanding, and whether the object that had chosen their harbor might someday return. Before I tell you the aftermath, subscribe so you don't miss any future videos. October 1967 faded into November, then December. The naval vessels departed Shag Harbour. The press moved on to newer stories. The official report concluded with clinical finality. No trace of an object was found. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. For the 11 witnesses who stood on the shore that October night, life continued in a subtly altered state. They returned to fishing, to school, to daily routines, yet carried with them the weight of an experience that defied conventional explanation. An experience officially classified as a UFO report in government documents, then quietly archived away. Laurie Wickens found himself changed in ways he struggled to articulate. Certain certainties had dissolved. The line between possible and impossible had blurred. He would startle awake some nights, the whistling sound echoing in his dreams, the amber lights pulsing beneath dark waters. When he looked up at the night sky above Shag Harbour, he did so with new eyes that had glimpsed something beyond ordinary understanding. The Chronicle, Herald's front-page stories remained preserved in scrapbooks and local memories. Could be something concrete in Shag Harbour UFO, RCAF. The quotes from Squadron Leader Bain acknowledging the significance of the incident. The follow-up headline: UFO, search called off. The Navy's statement: not a trace, not a clue, not a bit of anything. What lingered most persistently was not what had been found, but what had been officially acknowledged. The Air Desk at Air Force Headquarters in Ottawa, tasked with handling UFO sightings, had deemed the incident significant enough to recommend an underwater search. The Navy had deployed elite divers to comb the seafloor for 3 days. The military, with all its resources and expertise, had treated this not as the misperception of confused villagers, but as an event warranting serious investigation. What does it say about us that we need everything unexplained to be either fully understood or quietly forgotten? In the years that followed, the Shag Harbour incident became a quiet footnote in the study of unexplained phenomena. The Department of National Defense files were eventually transferred to the National Library and Archives, a permanent, if obscure, acknowledgement that something unusual had occurred on the night of October 4, 1967. The village itself slowly absorbed the event into its identity. Decades later, a small UFO gazebo and picnic site would be established 3 minutes up the road from the Shag Harbour Museum Center, where visitors could look out on the ocean to the location the object crashed. What had once been trauma transformed gradually into heritage, a distinctive chapter in local history. For Captain Pierre Charbonneau and First Officer Robert Ralph of Air Canada Flight 305, the sighting over Quebec earlier that evening remained an anomaly in otherwise unblemished flying careers. Their official report describing a brilliantly lit, rectangular object with a string of smaller lights trailing it, and the sizable silent explosion, followed by a second explosion that faded to a blue cloud around the object, sat in aviation records, neither explained nor discredited. Captain Leo Howard Mersey of the MV Nickerson never forgot the confirmation of his radar display, four stationary blips arranged in a rectangular formation matching precisely what he and nearly 20 fishermen observed visually in the rectangular formation matching northeastern sky. The validation of technology and human perception, aligned in witnessing something that shouldn't have existed according to conventional understanding. Young Darrell Dory, who had written to the RCAF Greenwood base commander about the large object maneuvering above the southwestern horizon visible from his front porch in Mahone Bay, grew to adulthood carrying the memory of something extraordinary and of authority figures who never provided satisfactory answers. None of the witnesses recanted. None embraced sensationalist interpretations or wild theories. They simply maintained, with quiet certainty, that they had seen something unusual enter the waters off Shag Harbour, something that had moved with apparent intelligence and purpose. The most profound legacy was invisible, a subtle shifting in worldview among those who had witnessed or been touched by the event, a new awareness of the vast unknown that exists beyond the boundaries of established knowledge, a humility before the possibility that the universe contains more than our sciences have catalogued or our philosophies have imagined. For Shag Harbour itself, the incident eventually became a part of its identity, as intrinsic to the place as its fishing heritage and coastal beauty. What began as an anomaly, a fracture in the ordinary, was gradually woven into the fabric of community narrative. The Shag Harbour UFO incident took its place alongside storms, shipwrecks, and celebrations in the chronicle of this small Nova Scotia fishing village. In the Department of National Defense files, in newspaper archives, in the National Library and Archives, and in the memories of those who witnessed it, the events of October 4, 1967, remain. Neither fully explained nor dismissed, neither proven nor disproving, a persistent question mark in the historical record. And sometimes, on clear autumn nights when the stars shine particularly bright over the Gulf of Maine, residents and visitors alike find their gaze drawn to that patch of water 300 meters offshore. The depth remains silent, offering no answers. But the question lingers, an echo stretching across decades. What entered the waters off Shag Harbour that night? And where did it go? The answer, if it exists at all, remains beneath the waves. If you enjoyed our video, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.